Today we're going to talk about the Jefferson Curl in the context of back strengthening, and we'll also break that up into a healthy back and healthy spine scenario and a non-healthy back and spine scenario. If you're struggling with lower back pain and you do need some help, click the link below and you'll go through to my How to Overcome Lower Back Pain online coaching and course, and the link below that will be the face-to-face lower back pain coaching. So if you click through to one of those, get in touch, fill out the questionnaires, I'll be in touch to get you booked in. Before we get into the ins and outs of the benefits of a Jefferson Curl, maybe the drawbacks of a Jefferson Curl, first of all we've got to understand what it is. So I've got a couple of dumbbells here. So the basic movement, now you would normally find me, or find anyone who's doing this, on a raised surface and then basically stretching down and then coming back up. So that is essentially what a Jefferson Curl is. Now, as I understand it, the Jefferson Curl originally was a stretch, which starts to put it into a different context to how it's being used and promoted these days, because a lot of people are using it for a strengthening aspect of their training. But if we look back to the origin of it, it was more a stretch, which would make a lot more sense for the posture and the position that you're in. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically break it down and talk about some of the benefits that people are touting for the Jefferson Curl, and then we're going to look at putting that into some degree of context. And what we'll do at the end is we'll look at some more effective and better exercises that you can put in its place. So number one is its low level loading of the spine. Now, as a stretch, that can be useful, and in a healthy back, that can be useful. If you've got a back pained back, then the rules in some respects are different. So all I've got here are two 5 kilo dumbbells, so it's a relatively low load. If we're talking about a deadlift of say 100 kilos, which would be obviously 10 times more than this. So if we're using it as a stretch, we're curling down, we're going all the way down, stretching again through the posterior chain, which people obviously mention that it is, which again, that can be useful. Posterior chain being calves, hamstrings, glutes, lower back, upper back, all the way up to the head. Again, we're going to be getting that stretch. And all the weights is doing is just enhancing that by essentially pulling the body to the floor. So as a stretch, that's absolutely fine. And in a healthy spine, that's absolutely fine. If you've got a back pain back that is aggravated by flexion, it's probably not the best thing to be doing. So it's understanding that to start with. Number two, it's complete back and hip flexion. Now again, that's fine at a low load. So within a stretch, that's advantageous. But again, if we're loading that, it's not the most advantageous position to be in, which is what we're going to talk about in a later part. Number three is it's protective of the back because it's strengthening the back muscles. Now, what we're making an assumption here is that the back muscles work like a bicep curl. So biceps get stronger when you sort of contract and extend, or contract and relax, so on and so forth. So basically they go through that contraction and relaxation phase. So what we're assuming is that the erector spinae muscles are the same. What we find the erector spinae muscles are is then, in some respects, they're not the same. They're most effective when they're in an isometric position and holding in position, rather than going through this sort of flexion and extension cycle. So if we make the assumption that they're like biceps and we need to do this to make them stronger, then yes, it may be back strengthening, but it's not necessarily protective. If we understand the mechanics of the back and the back muscles, we understand that it's more advantageous to be in this isometric position, which is essentially a static hold. Then it becomes more protective. And again, we'll discuss this at a later date. Number four is that it mobilizes the spine. And in some respects that's true because you are coming over into this position. But again, there is still always going to be a load on the spine when you come forward in this fashion. One thing that you can do, which we'll talk about later, if you want to mobilize the spine, it's more effective to come down on all fours. Because if we come into this position, there's even less load on the spine. And then we can take it through, again, not extreme positions to mobilize the spine. So what we start to find is that there's different contexts when it's useful to use that flexion and when it's not useful to use flexion. So now let's talk about how discs bulge or discs herniate, or how discs become damaged in some way, shape or form. Now there's a few different mechanisms for this, but we're going to talk about two. So the first one that we're going to talk about is flexion, which is that. Obviously extension is that, which is a different mechanism. And then you've got rotation. So these are all different mechanisms that can aggravate the spine. Obviously we're talking about the Jefferson curl, which again, if I was holding on to the dumbbells, so we're taking our spine into flexion. So as a position, it's not as advantageous because the herniation mechanism is being produced. Now, at body weight, it's not as bad. But if we add load into flexion, extension, or rotation, then it speeds up that herniation process because of the load. So if we are using body weight, for example, so like that sort of toe touch as a stretch, then it can become a problem, but let's just say a lot further down the line. If we add a little bit of weight, so 10 kilos, and we go down and we come up, now again, that will speed up that process faster than when it's body weight. If then we do that with a barbell, with plate weights on the back, and we go into this position with a lot more weight, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 kilos, whatever, again, it's speeding up that process because it's flexion under load. And the greater the load, the faster the problem happens, if that makes sense. It's the same with extension, it's the same with rotation, but because we're talking about the Jefferson curl, obviously we're talking about flexion. Now that is well documented. So if you go to any lumbar spine injury disorder, spine stabilization textbook, it will say, if it's talking about disc herniations, it will talk about flexion, full flexion and load is a problem for the spine. So what we need to be able to do is something a little bit more effective. And when we get to the exercises, we'll start to talk about what more effective exercises are. Now we're going to talk about how the spine is loaded. So in the last part, I talked about being in that flexion position, and if we load it, it speeds up disc herniation or the mechanism of disc herniation. And then it can happen at some random time because that's the straw that broke the camel's back. I've also mentioned that the erector spinae muscles work better isometrically and in a neutral position. So we're going to explore that a little bit more. So when we go into a hip flexion, so like an RDL, we go into a hip flexion and we maintain this neutral posture. And the neutral posture is a range, I understand that. But what we need to understand is that we need to keep that natural curve to the spine. Now what the erector spinae muscles are doing at this time is, if you can imagine, you've got vertebra sat on top of vertebra, and if I go and obviously tip my body over like that, obviously the vertebra go like that. Now what the vertebra want to do at this point is they want to obviously fall forward. Now obviously it's not going to on the spine, but when we go into this position and we engage these muscles, which they will be when we tip forward, is those muscles hold the vertebra on top of each other. So what it's essentially doing, it's called anterior shear. So it's a shear force that the vertebra wants to fall off the front. So when we come over, it holds all of them up and it neutralizes the anterior shear forces. When we go into this rounded position, that doesn't, or that neutralization goes away. So what we have to understand is that when we come into this neutral posture, When we come into here, our muscles are working more effectively to keep the spine healthy. As I've mentioned, we've obviously got the caveat of what we've talked about before. If we've got low load, or essentially no load with regards to exterior load being dumbbells, if we go into this position, it's not that bad for the spine. If you have a disc herniation, I wouldn't advise even doing it body weight, because you're already vulnerable because you've got that injury. If you've got a healthy spine, it's not the end of the world to go down like that and touch your toes. If you've had back pain, you've completely rehabilitated, you've had a couple of years of rehabilitation and it's healed, then you can start to go back to that sort of use of the spine. But again, the precursor for future injury is a past injury. So again, you've still got to be have an understanding of that. So what we're going to look at next is some exercises which are more advantageous than the Jefferson curl for strengthening back muscles. Now, I'm not going to go into the technicalities and the ins and outs of these exercises. I'm just going to sort of group them together as best I can in certain exercises. So from what we've talked about before, from understanding the anatomy and how it works and how it sort of neutralizes the anterior shears and how it prevents flexion, the first set of exercises we've got are three. It's the Romanian deadlift, the deadlift, and the single leg deadlift, or the single leg RDL, Romanian deadlift. So the Romanian deadlift is this position. So you would, for example, you would start at the top, you would come over. So what you're effectively doing is a hip hinge coming backwards and forwards, but you're maintaining that position of the spine. So you're maintaining the muscles in that isometric position, static position, and hinging up and down. Now that's essentially the mechanism for the deadlift. Now obviously the deadlift is a deadlift from the floor, because we are lifting a dead weight from the floor. But again, same principle applies. As we go down, we come into this position, we maintain through here, and then we come up. So we've lifted that dead weight from the floor and then we've put it back down again. Obviously in sort of powerlifting and at the top end of lifting, they will use certain bits of flexion of the spine. But again, we've got to understand the caveats of, is that a healthy spine? Is that not a healthy spine? If it's a healthy spine, then we can get away with flexion, brace around it to lock it in position, and then we can go about lifting. If it's obviously an unhealthy spine, it's not going to be that advantageous to go into that position. When we talk about single leg RDL, the position is exactly the same. The only difference being we've got one leg off the floor and up we come. Because again, all the time we've got that isometric neutral posture, or that neutral posture with the isometric erector spinae muscles holding it in place. That's what strengthens your back. And it's not even strength that prevents or minimizes risk of lower back pain, it's the endurance of the muscles. So it's not about flexion and extension cycles, it's about that isometric position. The next exercise is closely related to that, and it's the squat. And what I'm going to talk about here is more about the goblet squat. So what the goblet squat is essentially you're holding a weight, a bit like a goblet, and then you're squatting down. Because not only is the torso staying in that neutral posture, which is using the muscles isometrically and statically to hold everything in place. Because the weight is set on the front, you're getting a lot more activation out of the front of the body, or the anterior, the abdominal wall, which is then going to be supporting the lower back, because you have to look at these muscles like guy wires, and all the way around we want them supported at the back and at the front, and obviously the front and the sides is the abdominal wall, the rectus abdominis and the obliques. So we need that. So the squat is another good exercise for that, in particular the goblet squat, because we can get good hip range of motion, we get good activation through the torso, which is then supporting the erector spinae muscles, which is then going to enhance the strength of the area and enhance the endurance of the area. And then finally, at a lower level, we've got two more exercises, both done on all fours. Now, this is let's just say the beginner's end of the spectrum, but it's something that's fundamental that we don't want to lose. And we've talked about it all the way through. So when we come down onto all fours, we get that neutral position, we get the muscles activated, and then we extend. What we're not doing is going through an extension and flexion cycle. we're maintaining, and we're going out and holding. And then we're coming in, and then we're going out the other way. And then the final one I've already talked about is the cat-camel, because that's the lowest of loading on the spine, because we've got all four limbs on the floor, which is supporting the spine. And then what we're able to do there is do that rounding, flexion, extension, because we've got the lowest load on the spine, which isn't going to aggravate the discs as much as when we've got big weights in our hands. So it's understanding that all the way through. So there's some simple concepts of, let's just say, anatomy, and then you can layer on top of that biomechanics that start to tell us what exercises are more useful than others. And the Jefferson curl, if used as a stretch on a healthy spine, is more advantageous. Or I shouldn't say that, it can be useful. But if we do it with an unhealthy back, that we don't really know what the triggers are and the mechanisms are, then it's possibly going to be a problem in the future, and the exercises that I've just gone through are going to be more advantageous. Thank you for watching. If you found this useful, you're struggling with lower back pain, click the link, either of the links below, to the online coaching or the face-to-face coaching. Come and see me in the gym or come and see me online. I look forward to working with you in the future.